Thank you so much, Ernie. That was great. And by the way, I didn't think you were going to invite me to MC. I thought you were simply inviting me to attend, but nonetheless. There's a big crowd, and if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, we can entertain some. I think people also want to be able to connect individually, so we'll do that. So I know a lot of you. I don't know everybody, but if you'd raise your hands. Yeah, I see John Riddell, firstly.
It was a wonderful thing in Volume 2 when Jess Mackenzie comes into the book. And from that point on, the book has a special sparkle. And I'd like to thank Jess for that. But also suggest that she has more to say. There's a backstory there of her political activity in Canada and the birth of second wave feminism in Canada, which we must write about. And that said, I want to make a comment on the unique book. There's a place in the first volume where Ernie quotes Rostausen as saying that from the point of view of theory, Marxism is complete. There is nothing more to learn, nothing more to formulate. The task now is simply to popularize these ideas. But Ernie says that this is perhaps a little narrow. And in fact, the whole of Ernie's 2 volumes breathes the opposite of it, a spirit of innovation and the capacity to learn from social movements and develop revolutionary policy to help guide social movements. That is not just Ernie's personal characteristic, but the characteristic of the whole movement. And I will give very quickly 2 examples. When I, as a young anti-militarist campaigner in my high school, came to the Vanguard bookstore, the comrades there told me that I was on the wrong track, that the task was not to abolish military training, but to embrace it, so that we would be better trained to lead the insurrection. Now, it didn't take very long, not more than a couple of weeks, before Richard Bittler and I completely turned the organization around on this one, although at that time we were definitely wet behind the ears.
At the age 16?
Yes. And this was an aged policy inherited from decades of experience. Well, another thing that they had a policy on that I found out was that the organization did not recruit students. As a matter of principle, you should not recruit people who have not had constructive experience in the industrial working class. Now, I never saw that in so many words, but it was my experience that I couldn't get myself recruited. So I finally wangled an invitation to a meeting, and in the middle of it, I stood up and said, "Would you please recruit me to this organization?" And the organization on the spot surrendered and recruited me, and all the rest is history. So the organization was not as immovable as it claimed to be. And in fact, all the major campaigns and interventions of the 1960s, for better or for worse, were innovative, were based on, but yet going far beyond the traditions of Marxism in that sector. In the women's liberation movement with regard to Quebec and all the more. There's a whole story there, much of which Ernie writes and much more remains to be written. Now here is very important what Ernie says about those who write history make history, and we have some history to write in this room, and I think that we need to make a collective resolve, particularly the women comrades here, who are underrepresented among the survivors of this generation for reasons that we know well, that we must collectively write this history with our own insights and our own contributions. And I know there are projects afoot, and we need to get working on it and follow Ernie's wonderful example. Thank you.
Good evening, comrades and friends. Barry Weisleiter speaking for Socialist Action League pour l'Action Socialiste. Ernie's history of revolutionary activism in the 1950s and 60s is a great service to present and future generations of revolutionaries, even if they don't yet realize it. The 1950s was, as many have described it tonight, a period of repression and regression for the labor movement, not unlike the present period. So to the revolutionaries of the 1950s, we owe a debt of thanks for upholding certain very important principles. The idea of class independence, independence from the boss's state and its political parties, working class political action, including in the establishment of a labor party based on the unions, international solidarity, especially against imperialist wars and defense of revolutionary Cuba. Instead of revolution by stages, instead of a bloc with liberal capitalists, the perspective of permanent revolution, that only the workers and poor farmers can go all the way to transformation of society through the taking of power, and the fight for democracy in the workers' movement. Sadly, a very pressing task even today in the teachers' unions and others. Many of us wouldn't be politically active today, although I was born just 2 years before Ernie came to Toronto and didn't know this period until I learned about it in the early 70s when I joined the movement. Many of us wouldn't be politically active today if not for the work of the League for Socialist Action, Ligue Socialiste Ouvrière. Socialist Action, our organization today, stands, we believe, on the legacy of the LSA, and it informs our work in labor, the feminist movement, LGBT, anti-war, anti-poverty movements. And to this, of course, we must add a movement that wasn't known in the period that Ernie writes about, and that is the movement for ecology, for eco-socialist movement as we call it today. So everyone who values those principles, including the idea of class struggle unionism and support for national liberation for the Quebecois and Aboriginal peoples, should be working together today. So the question I'd like to pose to the author and to anyone else who cares to take it up: do you think there's a need for a revolutionary organization today based on the program and method of the League for Socialist Action? And why not, given that we face the same capitalist system, although we must say it is in a more advanced state of decay and destructiveness? I would just conclude by saying that if Ernie's two-volume work convinces even a few people of the need to build a revolutionary party today, it will have been a work well worthwhile. Thanks very much, Ernie.
Hi, I'm Ian Angus. I joined the Young Socialists in 1964 and the League for Socialist Action in the beginning of 1966. So basically my activity in the revolutionary left started around the time Ernie got away from Canada. His book, his first volume, was an astonishing book to me because it's about the period leading up to that period when the movement took off. That period when we suddenly recruited people like me. You know, when I joined, somebody actually sent out a letter saying, because I was in Ottawa, somebody actually sent out a letter that said we're now becoming a national movement because we were in 3 cities then. But as I read the book, there's a phrase that kept coming back to me, and it's from E.P. Thompson, the author of The Making of the British Working Class, one of the great Marxist historians of the 20th century. And he says in the preface to his book that one of his goals in writing that great book was to rescue the people who built those movements, and he's talking about the 1790s, to rescue them from the enormous condescension of posterity. And that's a wonderful phrase, because it's really easy and it's common to cynically look back and say there were little tiny groups with weird ideas, people who were outside of the mainstream, they really didn't influence much. It's really easy to kind of write it off, and it's really easy looking back from 50 or 60 years to say, well, they made mistakes and they got it wrong and we know better in our generation. But what Ernie has done in this volume is rescued an enormous number, well, a small number actually, of working class heroes from the enormous condescension of posterity. These were people that I knew, but I didn't, joining as a student, I didn't know what they had done. Meyer Shapiro and George Bryant and Harry Payne and a whole group of others whose names would never be in print if it weren't for this book, and they need to be remembered. The fact that they dedicated their lives to trying to build a movement and had an impact way beyond their numbers. And they didn't do it all right, but they did amazing things, and they committed themselves to changing the world at a time when simply going into the Vanguard bookstore could get you in all kinds of political and personal trouble, let alone building the movement. And the kind of effect they could have. Let me just give one anecdote that was told to me many times. And it's one of those things we used to brag about. as an indication of where things were going. Around about 1956, Ross Dawson used to be he was always mentioned as perennial mayoralty candidate Ross Dawson, because he always ran for mayor of Toronto every time there was an election. And one time he got 30,000 votes and scared the hell out of everybody. But that didn't happen too often. Well, this is around 1956 or 57 when the Communist Party was going through the crisis of the Khrushchev revelations and the Hungarian Revolution and so on, and a lot of leading members of the Communist Party were leaving, and some of them were showing some interest in the Trotskyist movement. Didn't go anywhere, but some of them were. And Ross was running for mayor. And I don't remember who it was, but it was one of the leaders of the CP came into the Vanguard bookstore one day and said to Ross, you're running a very good campaign. It's really impressive. How many people do you have here in Toronto? And Ross said, oh, something under 100. And he said, well, that's astounding that you can do that, but you might as well just give it up. You're never going anywhere with something under 100 people. Well, at that time, the Toronto branch was under 10 members. It had just had a big split. But this is the these were people who dedicated their lives to making that happen and getting the socialist message out in times when it wasn't a trivial thing to do, when it wasn't easy. And Ernie's book, there's all kinds of great politics in it, all kinds of great lessons, all kinds of strategic stuff that everybody should read, everything everybody's talked about. But what I love about this book is that he has saved human beings from the enormous condescension of posterity. Thanks, Ernie.
John Masters with the Trotskyist League Trotskyist. I have two brief comments. First, I think one of the reasons these books are particularly valuable is that the history of the Trotskyist movement in Canada is terribly documented. Ian Angus did a tremendous job with the first decade of the early CP and Canadian Bolsheviks, and since then there's bits on websites here and there, but nobody's undertaken the kind of work that, for example, Brian's done on the American movement to try to synthetically pull all this together. Our organization's lately been doing a lot of work on researching the history of the Marxist movement and the Quebec national question. But this is the sort of thing, frankly, it's the kind of people who are in this room. Some selection of them I really wish would take on a project like this, of the Trotskyist movement in Canada from more or less the 30s up to the mid-50s. It's needed for future generations. Okay, my second comment is more polemical. Brian sort of set this up by commenting that there's room for debate on all these issues. I think the elephant in the room here is what happened to the LSA, and for that matter, the SWP. How did they collapse and or thoroughly degenerate, as you can see with the American SWP today? And I don't think it's terribly helpful, or put another way, extremely superficial, to point to the individual failings of this or that leader, or the pathology of Jack Barnes, or what have you. I think it has to go back to a political program. Our tendency, or the founders of the tendency I belong to, fought inside the SWP in the early 1960s against what we considered growing political adaptation to non-Marxist forces. In this case, it was centrally Castroism and black nationalism. We were absolutely clear, yes, defend Cuba, defend the civil rights movement, but at the same time fight for Marxist leadership. We were bureaucratically expelled, an experience that so many more underwent many decades later. Well, I think that these issues have to be looked back at, have to be re-examined. I would argue the same kind of political adaptationism took hold, especially in the later 60s and the 70s in this country toward the New Democratic Party. These issues have to be discussed, and by the 1980s and early 90s, the forces that grew out of that experience, the remnants in the RWL and its offshoots, actually went so far as to support the forces of counter-revolution that destroyed the Soviet Union, the world's first worker state, in the name of democracy. So I think that's a terrible, terrible track record. And I think these questions have to be looked at again. And we're very glad I'm very glad Ernie's written the book. I'm only partway through reading it. And we're also very glad that in the past, despite our differences, we've been able occasionally to collaborate. The Healy incident at Friends Hall or Conway Hall, I forget which hall in London, where Healy did his thug attack, was not long after we'd had a similar experience at the hand of the Healy organization, and we were very glad to publicly take up a stand for him and against the political gangster Jerry Healy at the time. But I think we draw very different political conclusions from what's probably the vast majority of people in this room. Intervene, yes. Seek to give leadership, yes. But as to paraphrase something Comrade Trotsky wrote in the 1930s, we have to beware opportunism. That the road to opportunist political adaptation only leads to disaster, and I think an honest accounting of the history of the LSA and the SWP points to that lesson.
Yeah, I didn't see any other hands, so I'd like to ask Ernie to come back up and say a few words, and then we'll continue talking and having a drink and celebrating the book. Go ahead.
I would just add a couple of comments. One is, if we're going to talk about our history, it's not to settle old factional fights. We've got to be careful of that. Who's right and who's wrong. I mean, and it's very difficult. Those types of discussions are very difficult to settle, and I don't think necessarily convince anyone. It's not that I'm for looking at our history, for example, but I think what I'm trying to appeal to is we should have a sense of history and begin. The work, for instance, Brian has done, I would say it's his volume on the early revolutionary movement in the United States, the communist movement in the United States, is a profound study. He sets an example. If you follow if you read his method, he sets a very fine example. He tries to lay out the discussion so that the reader can make up their own mind. It's an interesting methodology. He starts with a certain confidence that if he lays out the argument clearly, his view is not absent, but he's fair in presenting. I mean, I've found it a very revealing methodology and a very revealing history. Very, very interesting. It should be read by everybody here. Absolutely. But what I want to say is, we could pick up the factional arguments, of course. But let me tell you what, and begin to go over that. But we're not going to vote on that kind of history. Because primarily, I'm interested in building a political movement. Not a movement that's going to be, well, we were right in this question, that way. But build a political movement that can carry out some political activity to win the working class to it. And it's not about those sectarian debates, comrades. I will say that. I think the comrade from the Trotsky's League, in the discussion on Cuba, I think you're going to lose that discussion. Absolutely. You were wrong at the time because you were calling for the overthrow of the Cuban Revolution as soon as it had virtually within a very short time after it had taken place. I know that. I was a supporter of Jim Robertson, and when he came up to Toronto and we had a meeting for him, I thought this was madness, absolute madness. I mean, and so it was just totally alienating. But let's not get into that. I will say, comrade, excuse me, I had to take a couple of the shots. After all. But I'm saying, if we're going to build a movement, it's about politics today. But then there's another set of politics that were expressed here, which I also disagree with. And this notion that our political activity is propaganda. The way we defeat our opponents is if we make good propaganda and we denounce them, and etc. And I've seen this so often used. And I think that's a sterile debate that has gone nowhere. As revolutionary activists, let me call it where we are, we're activists. Our idea should be to continue our discussion and win people to our ideas within the framework of making some proposals that change the conditions of the working class. That's what we have to do. We have to adhere to that methodology. That's what separates us and prevents prevents the pathology of sectarianism infecting us. I think it's a disease. It's an absolute disease. And we have to push it aside. It's totally alienated. And let me just end by saying, for me, I've had this discussion several times. Jess is telling me to shut up there. I've had this discussion many times. For me, this has been a joyous experience. My comrade Brian talked about sacrifice. I never ever considered this sacrifice. This is what I wanted to do. And that's a glorious thing, to do the things you want to do. So many working people are stuck at jobs, are in a total dead end, don't know what to do. We as revolutionary Marxists are doing things we want to do. And I think that's a glorious and an optimistic thing to do. So that's the last message I give you this evening anyway. Thank you.
Hear, hear. We would accept nothing less than Ernie ending on an optimistic note. There's no doubt, and I want to thank all the panelists, everyone who's spoken, everyone who's come out tonight. And I don't think there's any doubt that these volumes are a tremendous contribution to working class history in this country and the history of the revolutionary left. So we'll hope there is more, but it's a terrific book, it's a terrific read, and I urge everyone to buy it tonight. And again, thank you, and stay around, have a drink, and talk. Thank you very much.